and and also with Frank. But I was moving into the second year.
Oh, okay.
It's been sort of the story of my life. Not quite fitting in, sort of being in between, a little bit of both. So my connection is both with your class, Frank, and also the class that became the one that I moved into second year.
Yeah.
And so the only difference between us in terms of approaching studies and stuff like that is that I was coming from a pontifical seminary first year in at the University Seminary in Ottawa, at St. Paul's at the University of Ottawa, and moving into the second year in Rome. So then people say, well, what, how come, what was that about? Well, part of my story is that, is this okay?
Sure.
Tom?
Yeah, why don't we?
I don't know what your agenda is, but I kind of like telling a little bit of one another's stories and sort of how we got here, and I think has relevance to the topic for today's conversation.
Well, why don't we each take 30 seconds to introduce ourselves specifically to Bob. You all know who I am, and Bob and I had about a 10-minute chat before George came on. So
a prayer first.
I vote yes. Good call, Tim.
Good
you
call,
say it,
Tim.
Johnny. You say the prayer, Johnny.
I just watched another episode of Blue Bloods. Bless us, O Lord, for these gifts which we're about to receive from your bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
And
here comes another of God's gifts from his bounty. George
From his
Crook.
bounty, absolutely. But Bob.
Hi, George.
Hey,
welcome.
Hey, Georgie. Hey, George.
Hey, folks.
Hi, George Crook.
Greetings, Timoteo.
Okay, George Crook, we just prayed. We prayed in Thanksgiving for God's gifts, and you popped up. Let's,
Good call.
we're all going to be introducing ourselves for 30 seconds only, so that Bob Charpentier knows who we are, and then he'll take it over and tell us who he is. And between Bob and George Ferrick, you can kind of lead the discussion as to why George invited you. So,
Yeah.
George Ferrick, 30 seconds.
So I'll cede my 30 seconds since Bob knows
Okay.
my background.
Okay. Timothy.
Hi, I'm Tim Almy. I live in Flat Rock, North Carolina. I met this motley crew, many of them as freshmen in high school in 1956 at the seminary in San Fernando. I left seminary in the middle of freshman year college and have remained a stubborn lay Catholic for all of these years, and was invited to join this group by Johnny Grimmer, who is kind of the what would you say? Shepherd of the group. Recruiter.
Yeah.
Convener, shepherd. He's the good shepherd.
He was one of the original,
yeah, and
original
so it has
shepherd.
been, this is the one of, other than spending time with my wife and my family and my dog, this is like the third or fourth most important thing every week that I do, is just join this group. So
And
it's nice.
Tim, can I add that you're a Curcio Catholic?
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Tim, just quickly, how did you keep body and soul together in terms of being able to put food on the table over the years?
Oh, I taught university. I taught political science at the University of Georgia for 12 years. I got my doctorate at UC Riverside, and then went into the investment business as a financial advisor, and I did that for 40 years before I retired at the age of 62.
Uh-huh.
And that's how you come to have your Airstream.
And
You
just
did well in the
on
investment business.
a very personal note, for the last 15 years, my wife and I have been traveling the country in RVs, and we're getting set to go in 3 weeks to St. Joe, Missouri, and we're going to form a wagon train to Oregon, following the Oregon Trail. It's a bunch of Airstreamers, and we're looking forward to that. Really looking, it's going to be a 35-day caravan. It took the Pioneers 6 months. It's going to take me 35 days, in a lot better comfort, I think, than the Pioneers did. So
Sounds like great
It's
fun.
interesting. People do that kind of thing in Airstreams or on motorcycles, one or the other.
yeah.
Fred,
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Fred.
I was your classmate, but I don't remember you. I'm sorry to say.
I
That's
know.
because, Fred, you didn't go to classes and Bob did. Remember you said you stopped going?
I remember you as something of a myth of this guy who would be holed up somewhere, either teaching and or working on some project or studying, and our paths would cross because of required formalities, but that was about it.
Okay, thank you. So I after 3 years, because I had had a lot of Latin compared to many of my confreres in my year,
Oh, really?
they would ask me for help with the classes, especially Lonergan. His Latin was pretty difficult. And so I realized after a time, partly because of my acquaintanceship with Lonergan, that I was really interested in theology. And my bishop had said just before I left, "We're eager for you to come back and be a humble parish priest." I had thought I wanted to be that because I worked for such lovely parish priests. But I thought then my vocation was to teach. So I went to the University of Basel in Switzerland to get my doctorate. And after the doctorate in 71, I came to Boston College, where I've been teaching now for 51 years.
My God.
And as long as the pacemaker keeps ticking, I'll keep going.
And the paychecks keep coming in, and the paychecks keep
What
coming.
happens if my mind goes, so we'll see which happens first. Nevertheless, I'm married and have a wife and 2 kids, and now 8 grandkids.
Wow.
I'm very, very proud.
Hmm.
So that's pretty much it.
Lovely. I have followed your career related to NAC reunions and some online meetings over the years, and have come across references to you in mostly esoteric texts related to theology and other areas of interest. So you continue to be, for me, that person who's up in some location that I think he goes to school here, but I don't remember ever seeing him at the Greg or anything like that. And I know you went, and so at any rate, nice to see you again, Fred.
Thank you very much for it.
And I'm glad, and I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad you're still here and you haven't taken, this is your metaphor in one of the conversations in the past when we had a reunion, and you were lamenting that a number of our classmates have taken the long walk off the high diving board into the deep pool. I'm glad you haven't taken that walk yet.
and here comes Gary Lombardi.
Morning, good morning, good morning.
Another classmate.
And just one little sentence, Fred, it's because of your classmate, Larry Shalburn, that Bob is here today, because Larry having gone to a class reunion, told me he met this guy, Bod Charpentier, who lived up in my area. And so that's how I reconnected with Bob. Otherwise, we'd be, even though living
Just
10 minutes apart, I probably wouldn't have known that he was here. So it was due to Larry that Bob is here.
And now,
Shelburne
Gary,
was a classmate of Fred.
That's
Yeah,
right.
You're ahead of
yeah,
the rest of us who kind of got this started.
unlike me, he was together.
now Gary
Okay.
Lombardi, welcome, Gary. Gary Lombardi lives up in your area too, up in Santa Rosa.
I live in, yeah. Bob, where do you live?
I live in Kensington, a little community. If you didn't
yeah.
know, if you didn't know you were in Berkeley, you'd yeah.
I'm in Petaluma.
Yes. Now right where
Petaluma.
you are. Isn't that interesting? As close as we are, our paths have
Never crossed.
right. If memory serves me, and it doesn't always, but yeah, our paths have never crossed.
No.
How nice that I have this opportunity.
Yeah. Well, actually, George Ferrick and Bob basically live about 2 miles apart.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Let me show the see if I can find it here again.
It's only 2 miles as a crow flies, though.
Yeah, well, 2.2
To get up there,
according
it's-
to,
It's about 20 minutes.
Yeah, you're right. Wandering
Here we go.
around the hills.
here we go. Here's the map. Share. Okay,
notice-
this is George Ferrick over here, and this is Bod Charpentier over here.
Yeah.
Good for you.
2 mile walk would be good for you, George. I think you
Yeah.
could do that every day. Just take a little walk, 2 miles.
Well, what we do is meet at Blake Gardens and then walk in there. Yeah, that used to be the home of the UC Berkeley president, with the mansion and very nice grounds, and there's a redwood forest there,
Oh,
etc. Yeah,
And you've got a cemetery right in the middle between you.
that's right. Yep.
Sunset.
And adjoining the Blake Gardens, about a third of the property is a Carmelite monastery. So the family, in fact, with connections to the University of California, donated the property with the understanding that a part of it would become a Carmelite monastery, obviously Catholic roots, and 2/3 of it would become part of the University of California schools related to agriculture and forestry and gardening and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Absolutely gorgeous spot, one of the best kept secrets here in the hills. So about 7 acres of spectacular gardens and forests.
Well, Frank and Bob, introduce yourselves and what you're.
Okay.
Fine, Lee.
Okay. Well, Bob, we met many years ago. I came back. I was a priest of the Archdiocese of Boston for 9 years, and then I left and married. And my wife died about 7.5 years ago. I have 2 children, 5 grandchildren. After my wife died, I went to the cardinal, said, can I come back to the ministry? So I went in seminary for a year, took about almost a year for my papers to go through Rome. And I came back and was pastor of a parish in Sharon, Massachusetts for 5 years, and just retired the 1st of June. So I have 2 shifts kind of. In between, I worked for the state. I worked for Paul Tsongas, who was US Senator, ran for president in the 90s.
I remember him.
And I worked for Northrop, the aerospace company, and lived actually outside Los Angeles for 13 years in Thousand Oaks.
Got it.
So Bob and I had a back and forth after Bob wrote his book on the priesthood. And that kind of got picked up by George, and they invited the two of us to come as guests. And we were those kind of guests who haven't left yet. It's a vocation. It's a vocation. What else can we say? But the draw is what's kept us. This is a wonderful group. And, you know, I've been in groups before of people our age who are just complaining about everything.
Right.
This group is vibrant and they're thinking about the future, and it's a real gem.
Yeah.
Good. And
Thank
Bob
you.
Bonnot?
Right, Youngstown Diocese, Bob. Frank and I were classmates. I was one of the faithful go to school guys. I don't think I ever went down to St. Peter's to break into the council meetings and that sort of thing. I think that Frank and I were in class. We just missed Lonergan. And Fred was sort of the guy together with, who was your buddy with that also from out there, I think in Los Angeles, who was also a big Lonergan promoter. Who was that, Fred?
Frank Colburn.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, no, he went on to become a lawyer and he was a professor out in Indiana, the guy that I'm thinking of. I thought he was heavy into that too. I'm blanking on his name anyhow. You know, came back to Youngstown. I finished doctoral work at University of Chicago, and that was on administration for education. I never wound up being the administrator of education. And I had a variety of things, especially in media. I actually was down in Los Angeles, out in San Fernando Valley, moved out there. I was in New York, then I was down in Washington, then I was back in New York, and then I wound up out in Los Angeles working with what is today the Hallmark Channel. It was kind of an interreligious effort. And I suspect, Bob, that because I was out there and George brought me up and we got together for lunch or something. So I probably filled you in on a lot of my background at that point.
Yeah, I remember that visit.
Yeah.
Having a meal or two together. As I recall, I think you even came to my home here in.
I did. Yeah, I remember winding up the hill.
Yeah, you do wind up the hill. Yeah, because you also had an RV. RV. And, yeah, the big issue was where can we park it on those narrow, windy streets we have up here.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I survived.
Yes, and it looks like you are. And I've over the years have also followed your adventures with regard to the Association of Catholic.
Oh, good.
Priests
Yeah, great.
And Frank and Fred, do you remember Norb Dickman?
Yeah.
Frank, you would remember him. Anyway, Bob stated Norb Dickman was from Marin County, and he was quite successful as an attorney and ended up having an apartment over there that Bob, you stayed at, right,
Yes.
when you
Yeah.
made your journey. You were like John Steinbeck and his Rocinante going through America. You know, your RV reminds me of, except you didn't have a dog. That was the only thing missing, but you had everything else. But so Bob stayed at Norb Dickman's apartment. He was up here.
Yeah, that was also the first time I had visited with Dickman since we had left Rome. So that was another.
And then he went up to see you, Gary. Bob did.
Bob Bonnot?
Yeah, on his trip. Then I think he went up to see you in Santa Rosa.
He might have.
I went up in Santa Rosa. You know, I don't remember names real fast when it's, you know, meet and then you're gone. But I was up there and I visited one specific parish in Santa Rosa, but I can't button down just who it was or when.
Yeah, you may have been gone, Gary, because I called you to see if you could get together with Bob and the two Bobs and myself. You may have been on vacation or something. Yeah.
Yes.
Probably
Come to
golfing.
think of it. Yeah.
That'd be very
Golfing
fair.
somewhere.
I worked really hard as a priest. I would never take time off.
I have just a little vignette about Norb Dickman that's interesting. God rest him. Noah died a couple of years ago. When my wife and I got married in 1978, we went on our honeymoon to San Francisco. We stayed in this little boutique hotel right around the corner from the St. Francis. And so got up in the morning going out to look for a place to get breakfast. And we're walking down the street and I look and see someone in front of me and say, this looks familiar. And I call out Norb, and it was Norb Dickman. He turned around. So we went over and had dinner with him and his wife that night, etc. But what are the odds of something like that happening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Norb wound up being the head of a huge oil company. Yeah, for years.
Yeah, he did
And
well.
The last time I saw him was we had a kind of a 52nd and a half anniversary at La Posada Hotel right on the Mexican border in Texas. And my son lived in San Antonio, so I went to it. And that was he died shortly after that, actually. So
Johnny Grammer.
Okay, I'm gonna
Introduce
try
yourself.
to keep it, I'll try to keep it to that 30 seconds that you started with. Tom Welbers, John Grammer, George Ferrick, Tim Almy, and George Crook, and Gary Lombardi all started 9th grade together at St. John's Junior Seminary in San Fernando.
Queen
And
of
so
Angels.
excuse me?
Queen of Angels.
Yeah, Queen of Angels. I stayed through high school, college, and 2.5 years of theology. And I was kind of a goody-goody. And when I decided to leave, the rector actually said, John, anytime you want to come back, you're welcome. Well, I did not. I was blessed that Father B.J. McCoy got me a connection, and I was able to get a job at St. Bernard High School in Los Angeles and coach football and baseball. I was big into sports. Married, 4 children, 11 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, all Southern California people. But it's given me a chance to be sort of an anchor with Ted Howard and a few others of keeping our classmates in touch. And if you're not aware, Ted Howard wrote a book about our seminary years that is fabulous, and to some extent difficult because he highlights some of the folks that got off track. But we pray for all of them. So that's me, and I am absolutely every week looking forward to this gathering, and I think, Bob, you can see why.
Uh-huh.
John, let me ask you a question. So he offered you this free pass back to theology.
That was
Do you think
Keneally.
Do you think you can still take the new rector up on that?
Hell no. Good question though, Tim. How times have changed. Oh my goodness. But Frank, you are a wonderful example of how times have changed, and to be ordained, married, and do we say it, reordained?
no, I wasn't reordained. I didn't have to be reordained.
The first time worked.
Yeah,
First, good call, Fred.
it was just laicization just puts ministry on the shelf.
Okay,
So I had to be reincarnated, but not reordained.
got it.
Yeah.
Sacred mark and all that, right?
Mhm.
Character, yeah.
I thought that'd be obvious, George.
Never went away.
But Frank,
It has been.
Frank, were you reduced to the lay state?
Yes,
Reduced.
Now,
Yeah.
what about expanded to the lay state?
I think of it as being elevated.
Yes.
yeah, I was reduced to the lay state. And that's why I had trouble coming back, because I had to get unreduced. And because of my age, it went to Doctrine and Faith. And they said no 3 times, and O'Malley persisted. And then it went over.
They said no 3 times.
Yeah, Doctrine and Faith said no 3 times. And O'Malley wouldn't take no for an answer.
God bless his heart.
He told the Pope about it in a conversation. And the Pope said, take his file from Doctrine and Faith and take it over to clergy and tell him I told you to do it.
No,
That's how it happened.
God bless him.
That
Well,
was
Probably one of
it was my sainted mother who had the foresight to name me Francis in 1942.
That was
Which
probably
pope?
one of the that was probably one of the few things that they obeyed Francis on.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it was at a point too when he was really
Oh.
sidetracked.
Was
really
Francis the
sidetracking
guy?
Doctrine and Faith. Huh?
Was Francis the Pope that you were referring to?
Yes.
No, Bob,
Didn't sound Benedict-like.
Huh?
I said, it didn't sound Benedict-like.
No. Well, O'Malley has this relationship with Francis too, so, which makes me feel bad in a way, because if someone in my situation comes from a small diocese somewhere and Doctrine and Faith says, no, that's it. Kind of.
And that was Bob, your situation.
right. That's another whole story.
Yeah.
did you go to the North American College, Bob? That's how you all know each other?
I did, yeah.
For what diocese?
Worcester,
Oh, Worcester.
right.
Yeah. You
The
know,
heart of the Commonwealth.
do you know Jim Houston? You know,
Yes, Jim. Yes, I knew Jim. Yeah, yeah.
that's where your name is familiar to me.
Yeah.
So what happened to you then?
Well, I want to make sure everyone's had a chance. I'll tell you a little bit, tell you my story, because it is linked to the topic.
George Crook, do you want to say something?
Believe it or not. Where's
Please, George.
Oh,
George
very quick. Okay. Well, as John said, I entered 9th grade with everybody in 1956. I quit in 64 at the end of either college or second year philosophy, depending on how you want to refer to it. Taught high school for at Salesian High School in East LA for 7 years. I got very involved in what was then called the Chicano movement. And that's a whole series of stories, but went to law school after that, practiced corporate litigation for 20 years. Then I moved and started representing disabled kids under a federal statute called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that made quite an impression on me, because some of these kids are, walking disasters and are very handicapped. And I came to think of their parents as absolute heroes. And I would, when I'd give a speech or something, I'd say, my clients are my heroes. And they were, they really, truly were. Retired a couple of years ago in theory, got married in 65, that didn't last. Divorced 82, I guess, 86 or 86. Remarried, and that seems to be working. And so that's the story.
That means she's putting up with you.
That means she's putting up with
Good
me.
call, Fred.
Now, who did you remarry, George?
Pardon me?
Who did you remarry?
Betty Barnes. She's the sister, that's what you're looking for, Tom?
Yeah.
The retired bishop of San Bernardino, Riverside, Gerald Barnes. A very, very progressive and good guy. Now retired.
Interesting connections.
George, I just want to say a friend of mine who's been married for over 50 years says the secret is this: it's better to be happy than right.
Yeah.
I would concur.
Happy wife, happy life.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if it might be good now for Bob to take it away.
Okay.
But
I
we
hope-
haven't heard from Gary.
Gary.
Gary, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I went to the seminary, St. John's in Camarillo, and then in my last year, I went through a kind of a crisis of conscience and confidence, and I ended up finally not being accepted into Los Angeles, but I came to Santa Rosa Diocese, and I was accepted there, and I've been here ever since. I was ordained in 1969, and I've just gone through basically a parish priest. Went through 3 different parishes as an associate, and then as a pastor of a smaller parish, then pastor of a middle-sized parish, and then pastor of one of the larger parishes of our diocese. I retired about 5 years ago, and for about 16 years I was involved in clergy education. So I got my taste of national life by becoming part of a group called NOCER. And I was on the board and I was director of the region and that sort of thing. So, and I also was involved in the catechumenate for many years on a team from called the North American Forum on the Catechumenate. They went around the country giving workshops to lay people in catechumenal ministry. So I was sometimes a part of all of that. So, but I retired 5 years ago, and it's been a wonderful time. I'm very happy to be retired. So that's a little about me. So.
How nice. Yeah. I'm hoping this will continue to be a conversation, meaning no way is this a lecture. I'm completely interruptible. And so I'm hoping we'll continue to be in dialogue. But
Bob, you also have a time limit, right?
you know, I had. On the other hand, you may want to say, well, you still have. George knows I'm into dogs. I think of it as my four-legged ministry. I do foster care for guide dogs for the blind, located in San Rafael, California. As a matter of fact, I have a lovely, almost 2-year-old black lab who's recovering medical issues, lying on a carpet upstairs this morning. And so I've been going back and forth to the clinic in San Rafael. It's a bit of a drive. And long story short, he was scheduled for an appointment today, and they called me and said, our specialists are here from UC Davis, from the vet school. Could you bring him in yesterday, or rather Wednesday, leave him overnight, etc. Long story short, everything that's all behind me at this point, and the doggy's doing great. So I'm not in any great rush.
So your hours until noon.
You're all aboard till noon. I may not last quite that long, and or you may say that's enough, Bob. And we've heard it over and over again. So let's see where.
But let me just say something. We've got 2 people on here, Frank and Bob, who were invited for one day, who now 6 months later are still on this conference call with us. So anyways, the time limit doesn't work with this group very well.
And always bring the dog.
Good insight, Tim.
And
For
Tim,
you.
Tim, yeah, I can begin from the short time I've been with you. I can begin to understand how that might be so. And
Yeah.
and I think God is full of surprises.
Yep.
What would be helpful for you to know? Well, I'm one of those people, and you probably have run into them, who just never knows what they want to be when they grow up, and that's still my issue. In my 81st year, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, and that's really been my journey. My undergraduate work was in pre-med, and that was because I was trying to avoid recognizing a vocation. There were enough priests and nuns in my French Canadian family growing up in North Central Massachusetts, but there were no doctors, no physicians. And so I decided we need to have one, and that's going to be me. And so I went to college, did a straight pre-med curriculum, got into medical school, early admission, the end of my junior year at Tufts Medical School in Boston. My interest at the time was primarily psychology, psychiatry. I was intrigued with what made people tick and what was that all about. And at the same time, I was wrestling back and forth with a sense of call. I can remember moving back and forth between my spiritual director, my different classes, and I finally said no to the medical school in Boston. So I'm one of those people who got into med school and said thanks, but no thanks. It's usually the other way around. Had a conversation with the then bishop in Worcester, Bernie Flanagan. He said, "You really are interested in doing this? And where would you like to study?" And I said, this was during the time of the council. I said, "Well, it looks like the action is in Rome. How about there?" He chomped on his cigar. He looked at me and he said, "Well, tell you what, sounds like you're interested in studying outside the country. I don't know you. You don't know us. Let's try a pontifical seminary, which will put you in the position. We can talk again in a year, see how things go." It was a terrific experience. I had decided that theology, unlike the natural sciences pre-med, was not rocket science. And I had loved all my classes in philosophy and theology and stuff. Long story short, I had a great year at the University Seminary in Ottawa, and actually wrestled with staying there because it was a very wonderful experience. But had the conversation with the bishop, and he said, "Well, I'm leaving for Rome on the boat so and so. We can go over together." And it turned out he did, and my classmates who were here, sort of classmates, because I went over on the boat, but I was moving into my second year, and they couldn't figure out who I was. And Fred, I wish I had known at the time about your expertise in Latin, because I moved into second theology in Rome without any auditory Latin, that whole first year experience. And I had to hit the road running. Well, let me tell you, my head was spinning for much of the year in terms of trying to figure out what was going on in this strange language and stuff. Well, what also happened is that in the course of that year, I also began to develop GI symptoms. Long story short, it turned out that I was one of those people sitting at the protein table. I at the time was like most of the folks at that table, as far as I can determine, and the docs have figured out. We were most of us were pre-diabetic. I was undiagnosed pre-diabetic at that particular time. And so long story short, after 2 years of theology, basically that year in Rome, into my third year in Rome, I had a conversation with the bishop and the physicians after they tried to treat me. God only knows. Remember the Italians? They love to give you a needle for everything. And that led to all kinds of problems for me. I won't go into those. Long story short, I ended up coming back to the States. Instead of going into my fourth year of theology, I returned to the States for medical care. And that took some time. I got diagnosed at that point, borderline diabetic. And so they started treating me for that particular issue while I was there. But also it was a terrific opportunity to dig in to psychology / counseling. And so when the bishop said, well, what do you want to do for that year? Well, I looked at the possibility. It was third year, and I didn't know at the time, but I created a deacon year before there was such a program. And so I looked at a number of different settings, and I said, what I would really love to do is do a master's in psychology and counseling, and be involved in a parish, but functioning there primarily as a lay person. There was nothing organized the way the deacon year was. Long story short, I completed that master's in psych and counseling. It was like I had been doing that on my own informally, so it was really a lot of fun. And time to return to Rome. And at the time, I didn't know that, and the bishop didn't either, that Rome had a policy, informal or whatever, who knows, but that anyone who'd been away for the third year of theology had to repeat the third year of theology because of early ordination in Rome. And so the bishop said, do you want to do that? Repeat the third year? And I went, He said, I thought you might say that. Just so happens that in the house today, this was the chancery, called chancery in those days, the rector of the American College in Louvain is here today, and I'd like you to have a chat with him. And long story short, there again, before I left the chancery that day, I was made to feel that I would be very welcome to do my final year of theology at Louvain. And since I already had completed the STB, and of course Louvain looked upon Rome in those days as a diploma mill. You got the STB from Louvain only after.
What an insult.
You had to put in 4 years. So, but I already had it. And so the rector and of the American College and my bishop, Bernie Flanagan in Worcester, basically said, as long as you do the core classes, and it looks like it's only a few of them related to sacraments, and then pastoral practice, they had the nerve to call it pastoral counseling in those days. Learn how to do that. Whatever you want to do, you can do. Really? And so my last year of theology in Louvain turned out to be an absolutely amazing experience, because I did the core requirements, but I basically went to school with doctoral students at the University of Louvain in theology, and also Fred de Higher Institute van Gott in the Weltanschauung, the higher institute of God in the world, an amazing study and center based in Louvain and in Brussels for all kinds of cutting edge theology that was going on. And also there was an institute in Louvain that had got launched earlier. I remember telling George about it, sort of tongue in cheek, saying, "Hey George, do you know the 2 places in the world you can get a master's degree in sex?" And he said, "Huh?" And I went, one was, believe it or not, in the 60s, late 60s at Louvain, and the other one was at Oxford. And these were very serious programs. So all of that to say, one of the seminars that I took with doctoral students from all over the place was with this amazing professor whose name was Victor Leonard Heylen, Heylen. And his dates are 1906 to 1981. He was a priest, Monsignor from the Archdiocese of Mechlin-Brussels, which was right close by, and he was professor of moral theology at Louvain from 1956 to 1977. Although he wasn't formally a peritus at the council, he was the final redactor of the document, the section on de matrimonio from on the Vatican document Gaudium et Spes, which you may or may not remember, one of the documents of Vatican II. So he was a pretty impressive guy, but he was also the most simple guy, the most amazing, humble gentleman whose teaching methodology was an absolute eye-opener for me, an experience that I hadn't had up to that time in my life. And his approach was essentially Socratic. Throw a problem out there, and the name of the seminar was the English, it was in French, the English translation would be problems related to human sexuality and family life, des problèmes de la morale familiale et sexuelle. And he'd throw these different problems out there, and it's 1968, so guess what happened later in 1968? So we really delved into birth control, and he basically predicted what would happen, again, Socratically, without answering any questions to what would happen in terms of whether or not the document would be accepted or rejected, and we know where that one went. But the one that really got my attention was his whole approach to the issue of abortion. And this is mostly from memory. Forgive me if I don't have all the details, but the one detail that struck me as he looked at and laid out Socratically the issue related to the whole issues looking at the biblical background, the historical problem, the sociological problems, the medical issues related to it. What struck me, old pre-med Bob, was the striking fact, the first time I ever heard it, and he said, as best as we can tell, as many as 50% of implanted zygotes are spontaneously aborted in the first weeks to month, up to about 12 weeks. And then then in his style, French, he just laid out the issue this way, and he said 50% of zygotes are spontaneously aborted. It may be higher, it may be a little lower, but there was a medical school and a medical center. He was very well informed with regard to the numbers. What strikes me is, and I'll share with you data and information from Google Scholar looking at some of the medical statistics, he was darn close back then. The numbers actually, most experts would say slightly higher, actually in the mid 60s. And then he laid the problem out this way, and he said, as believers, if, and we had looked at the issue of ensoulment, if ensoulment, the soul entering into the body, happens at the moment of conception, more than half of the beings in heaven are zygotes. More than half of the beings in heaven are aborted fetus, aborted, they're not yet formally a fetus. That happens after 12 weeks when you use the technical term. These are still zygotes. And then in French, it's a lovely lovely expression. It reminded me of some of the French Canadian expressions that my grandma, aunts and uncles, grandma used to, he said, "Mais ça c'est curieux. Ça c'est curieux. C'est tellement curieux." And sort of imitating his style. And that would translate roughly to, "Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Don't you think that's interesting?" Kind of.
The
And,
Socratic question.
huh?
It's a
Yeah,
Socratic question.
He just laid it out. And let me tell you that not only got my attention, but kind of got the attention of everybody else in class. And it's the first time I had ever approached, sort of traditional Catholic understanding today, which as my current research and in full disclosure, I went checking on Google Scholar. If you've never used that for doing some basic kind of research, Google Scholar is quite amazing. And an interesting statistic, he said 50%. Let me just throw out a few stats for you. And it may not sound it, but I am interruptible at any point. You can just go ahead and say.
Did he draw any conclusion, Bob, other than, isn't that interesting?
No, he just left it hanging right there. The context of this, and I'm being unfair to you, of course, he looked at what the biblical positions were. We looked at interfaith issues. The fundamental issue is the question he would ask is, when does ensoulment take place? Even that was a new expression for me. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. And traditional Catholic understanding is that ensoulment takes place at the moment of conception. That's where he creates the problem of heaven peopled mostly with zygotes.
So do you recall where
they aren't baptized, these zygotes? So in traditional Catholicism, how do they make it into heaven?
He was giving him the benefit of the doubt. I'm jumping to contemporary theology and sort of looking at some of the famous Jesuit theologians in particular who basically describe them as, anonymous Christians. They've never been baptized, never had the opportunity. The God who loves us so much that he doesn't lose any of his creation, and he certainly would not reject. He certainly would not reject these.
What did he mean by ensoulment? Is that kind of an injection of soul at a certain point in time? The whole notion is kind of
right. Yeah. Well, the notion goes back to basically early church fathers.
Right.
And he quoted a number of them, which was another interesting issue. The early church fathers, the first 2 centuries into the 3rd century, were debating among themselves when ensoulment happened. I remind you, and you probably knew, Augustine did not, even though if you look at a lot of modern sources, they'll say, "Oh no, moment of conception." Around the more Jewish traditional, up to the present time, notion that ensoulment becomes a human being, the zygote becomes a human being around the time of quickening. That's somewhere around the 3rd to 4th month when their mother begins to, I like the notion that the human being themselves play a role in the decision of when ensoulment happens, and that when there is motion that's detected, and the mother and sometimes the father placing his hand can feel motion for the first time. So the Jewish knows, but he said even among the fathers there was great division, and I cannot remember which one of the fathers, but he said he named the great father of the church. I won't even throw out a name because I just don't. The one I remembered was Tertullian, but Tertullian's tradition. Tertullian was very traditional in terms of his understanding, and that was a moment of conception. But there were other church fathers who said no. Augustine basically said no, more like the time of quickening. He was in doubt. Guess what? Aquinas, following Augustine, basically also did not hold to the notion, which was another whole issue, problem, conversation related to, well, how did we end up with the moment of conception as the moment when the soul enters the body? And this was basically he attributed to the Jesuits and the whole the concept of tutiorism, the safer path, and probabilism, which, by the way, I personally kind of espouse. I'm trained by the Jesuits in my own thinking. Take the safer path. If we don't know, if there's some doubt. Hello. That's not me, I don't think.
Bob, can I make a comment?
Of course.
The word that pops out at me, and I'm kind of taking my contemporary consciousness and what people may say, especially women, but the word fathers stood out. Where are the mothers?
Yes.
Where are the mothers? You know, the fathers are deciding,
Right.
Kind of puzzling this out, but the mothers are non-existent.
Right. I agree. That itself, George, nice Socratic approach question that you're doing, for me creates a problem. If half of humanity is not involved in the conversation, do we have the whole truth? Interesting question. If input from women is not present,
Well,
could it be that we're missing something here?
Well, yeah, and it's personal to me because I told my wife what the topic was, that you were going to be here, and she says, "Why don't you invite a woman to the group?"
Yeah.
And that's a Socratic question too.
Right.
But many women say, "What are white-haired old men doing deciding about our bodies and making decisions about our lives and deciding that a 10-year-old should be able to, bring her child to birth and no big deal, what some legislators are saying." So,
but George, that may well have been true when the fathers of the church were developing their opinions. It's not true in our society today.
That's right. It isn't.
Abortion litigation is being written by men.
That's right.
That's not true.
No, I know.
Well, what's interesting is that it's still one of the talking points of the pro-choice, pro-abortion movement, that men are making these decisions about women's bodies.
Not disproportionately, not anymore. I mean,
yeah, but it still is a talking point of that movement.
Yeah, but there's no substance to it.
Well,
these days,
right?
Well, George, just look at the Supreme Court and look at the College of Cardinals. How many women are members of the College of Cardinals?
Give Francis time, George. Give Francis time.
Give him time.
Right.
He's making steps, that's for
It'll
sure.
be Francis V that will take care of that.
Francis just appointed 2 or 3 women to be on the clergy, the
Congregation of bishops.
bishops. Yeah.
For the,
I,
for the selection of the Pope, yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I'm George, in response, I'm aware, I didn't become a physician, but I married one. My wife is now deceased. She died of a terrible cancer 12 years ago, as sometimes happens to doctors. She was a pediatrician originally, but retooled to become a pediatric and adult allergist immunologist. And so there's a part of me saying, if she were here, she'd be part of this conversation, because over the years we had a lot of interesting talks related to many of the issues that interested me in theology. She was very traditional. She was a Manhattanville, the Madams, the Religious of the Sacred Heart graduate, and then went on to Georgetown Medical School and did her residency in pediatrics at UC San Diego, and also went on to do a postmaster's maternal and child health, public health master's at Berkeley. So she had a private practice. She was also on the teaching faculty at the medical school in San Francisco. So she's a pretty potent woman, and anyone who'd met her knew that she was not shy, and she was very outspoken. Mary Alice Murphy.
Bob, if you can channel her, what would she be contributing? What questions or thoughts?
Well, I think the input would be very feminine, along the lines of we weren't there, we weren't part of the, when so many of these decisions were made. We weren't part of the conversation, and all these decisions were made without our input. And so if you were in my shoes, how would you treat these have to, must be's? Might you have some doubts? Might you have some wonderments? I suspect that would be an accurate mini channeling. On the other hand, she was such a strong, powerful, bright woman that I wouldn't dare try to tell you what Mary Alice would say, because she'd probably give me her sideways glance and said, "You're way off the mark, Bob. Here's what's really going on." So
Bob, let me ask you this though, and partly I'm doing this to be a devil's advocate in the conversation, but partly I'm not. These are tough questions, and this group has discussed abortion a fair amount, and I've been one of the liberals in the group, in part because of the spontaneous abortion statistic, which has really influenced my thinking big time.
George, if I can support you just for a minute, I'm the first of 5 children. My mother, a nurse, my dad, a machinist. My mother had 3 miscarriages. And remembering those experiences, it was sad, but there's no way that any of us considered those
babies
baptism as ensoulment. Is that the word? I'll let you go back, George, but I want to support my personal experience with what you just said.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was just huge to me to find that out. My first wife and I had a stillborn child, the full 9 months. And I remember I was just stunned to find out that the church at that time, at least, Tom, had no liturgy to deal with this. There was no funeral, no common, no nothing, except what the priest cribbed together, at the gravesite. And I was stunned. And I mean, here's half the human race dying before birth, and the human race has never developed a liturgy for that, or a mourning system or anything. And that to me speaks thunderously about what the sensus fidelium is on the subject. It's a damning statistic to the life begins at conception and that's the end of the discussion. Now, having said that, the way this has been approached over the centuries has been, well, what's a fetus? What's an embryo? What is? And if it's a living human being, then no abortion. If it's not, well, I guess plenty of abortions. What, George, would the presence of mothers of the church have added to that analysis? I mean, it was metaphysics that they were talking about, not women's rights.
Could I add one other consideration, that up until very recently, a woman's common experience of motherhood was that it was highly likely that she would die giving birth. That the maternal and infant mortality rates, and the other thing is, so many infants died before they got to be 5 or 6 years old. So the infant and maternal mortality rates, without any true medical intervention possible in any of those, would also, I think, have to be something to consider in, where is God's will in all of this, which is, one way of expressing what one kind of traditional Catholic way, at least, of expressing the question, where is God's will in this whole development of life? Or to put another way, what the hell is God doing? and that I don't think has come into male theology, but it would certainly be an integral part of the female experience that should go into theology.
Right. Just to throw out a little bit more data right here for us to ponder, sort of operating Socratically. One source published in 2017, a researcher named Jarvis said, it's widely accepted that nothing new here. It's widely accepted that a substantial proportion of human embryos die within a few weeks of conception, with estimates of losses from conception to birth often exceeding 70%.
Wow.
Taking another stat, building on that one, if you accept just the midpoint of Jarvis's 2017 range from 40 to 60% is 50%. If you just drop it down even to 50%, which is striking because Professor Heylen in Louvain, that was the number he had used. And when I was doing a little research to catch up on some of this, I went, wow, he was right on target. Quoting again, if the midpoint of Jarvis's 2017 range, 40 to 60% is used, 50%, this means the number of spontaneous abortions is equivalent to the number of births, 133 million. Removing embryonic pregnancies yields 88 million spontaneous abortions of human beings. Using our 60% rate, they use aneuploidies. Those are chromosomal aberration problems. Using our 60% chromosomal aberrations account for 37% of the spontaneous abortions, and induced abortions another 39%, and all other causes 24%. But what's striking in this statement is it's equivalent to the number of births, 133 million. And that is a statement, again, that's research from 1917.
1917?
1917?
2017, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fairly recent. You want, go ahead, Fred.
So let me ask a question, if I may. And Frank asked a question about the concept of ensoulment.
Ensoulment.
Is it critical to our Catholic teaching to know when that happens? I mean, and I guess what I'm just struck by, the conversation we're having, because you listen. We're having politicians make these decisions about the issue, and we're having the Supreme Court weigh in. Anyways, what if we knew when this thing called ensoulment happened? Would that allow us the latitude then to say, well, up to that point, it's not life? I guess I'm confused by what does it mean to that thing that's in a woman's womb, that something is ensouled, that something happens to bring the soul in. Does it in any way, do we think, change the nature, the biological nature of the fetus?
Fred, do you have a thought?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say about Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, please.
He said the soul wouldn't enter the body until the matter was disposed in order to have the soul as human. And that's why he put it at a rather late date. And
what did he mean by that? Fred, what did he mean?
I think
this is Aristotelian philosophy background that forms, the form of the matter is what constitutes the thing to be what it is. And so unless the form is adequate to being ensouled, it wouldn't be ensouled yet, according to Thomas Aquinas, because the soul is the form of the body. I don't know whether that makes sense.
Could I interject just a little bit of humor there? Those who have taught high school or worked with high school students might very well have reason to wonder if ensoulment has taken place by that time. More seriously, a Socratic question that I would develop on Tim's point is, and I'd really like Bob's comment on this, to what extent perhaps has modern psychology challenged the notion of ensoulment, the classical notion of ensoulment anyway? A reason why I ask that is, the soul was responsible for all the stuff, all the human stuff that we didn't have another answer for. Now, we've got a lot of answers about how the brain handles things that were formerly attributed solely to the soul. And again, asking that question, where do you think, Bob, that we might want to take that? And should the concept of ensoulment be, in its classical sense, should that be rethought?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for instance, is ensoulment a package that you plug in at a certain point? Or, for instance, is there an analogy with dying? Is dying something that the switch gets shut off, or is it a process of growth towards God? Do we just die, or does the Lord come to meet us on the way? And it seems to me that if we think of ensoulment, I mean, the very word itself seems to me to say, there's this little package, and at some point you plug it in and zip, you're off.
Right.
Well, is that a Catholic
well, but-
teaching now?
Well, and let me say too, that this whole talk of ensoulment, I'm just imagining myself as a non-believer or an atheist. They wouldn't know what the heck you're talking about and why you're talking about it. They
Right.
would be talking about it in different terms.
Right.
Yeah.
They would say, you're already making a binary thing out of it when it's not binary to begin with. So you could say ensoulment would happen at conception. Why not say that? Or why not say whatever? But they wouldn't even be talking about souls. So that's a whole other aspect, which
Well, do
Which I
we
don't wanna-
talk about it in this context, that there comes a moment in a pregnancy when there's a thing called ensoulment? I mean, I thought that was discarded, pre-Descartes or something.
It's a very old or very ancient notion. It goes back to the first centuries of Christianity. The Didache speaks of it, and then the notion, though, is the term is mostly attributed to the church fathers, absent church mothers, who spoke about ensoulment. I made the parallel in my own mind, for right or for wrong. It's okay based on what Professor Heylen was throwing out there Socratically, as we looked at the various world religions, a number of whom, to put it most simply, just basically said, and soul, and if they didn't use it, the soul is infused into the body, and so it happens somewhere around quickening, to reflect what Fred said earlier, what Aristotelian philosophy and Aquinas basically built on, because he also said the same thing, somewhere around quickening, that happens somewhere around 3 months or so. And up to that time, this is a being in potentia. This is, but it doesn't happen until, it depends on what the approach is. An Aristotelian would just, might describe it as Fred had said. And so,
Interestingly enough, when I was in Switzerland, I read an article by a Swiss psychologist who said that the first sense that develops in a human being is the ear. So from a very early stage of life, the baby hears the mother weeping, laughing, doing all these kinds of things. And what happens during that time before they're even born really does have a tremendous effect on the way they operate after birth.
right.
And so that's the most interesting thing I read about this issue.
Right.
So I would say when the kid hears it has a soul as the condition of the possibility for its hearing.
That just struck a chord for me, Fred. One of the things I still haven't decided what I want to be when I grow up. Back in 2011, 2012, I did a postdoc fellowship in interdisciplinary palliative and hospice care chaplaincy training at the Palo Alto VA hospital. And one of the things that I learned echoes what you're saying. The last sense to go for a dying person is hearing. First sense, last sense, isn't that, as my professor would say, isn't that interesting?
Well, many of us are already halfway. We're already halfway to dead.
Yeah.
That's what I'm taking out of this.
In fact, Bob, don't some people say that actually after you're clinically dead, you still have some potential hearing for a short period of time? Have you ever heard that?
Well, when that issue got raised in some of the classes that I was involved in,
Yeah.
it always expanded into when is clinical death?
Right.
And that is more and more.
Because that's the argument, that's the debate we're having on the
you
other end.
say there's no more brainwave activity.
Yeah.
But even that now is like, it's one of the accepted clinical signs of corporeal, of physical death.
Right.
And something else is still going on.
Right.
And
Right.
So,
And some,
so even today, are we still being ensouled?
the very,
I'd like to contribute something to the conversation here. I've been struggling with this whole topic for a year, and I think that came up a couple times, and I commented on it. One of the things, I'm working on writing stuff, and it's real labor. I felt this whole thing of personhood. When does personhood start? And I thought to myself, well, let's look at Genesis. Let's look at creation. And the way in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, what you have is God creating the universe. And I think science, by and large, accepts the Big Bang understanding, which was done by a priest, I think in Holland, or someplace up where you were.
George Lemaitre.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Lemaitre.
Yeah. That Big Bang, but science has bought it because he was a
That's what we
scientist.
got here.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Yes.
right, there it is.
So, you know, and if you look at, so that element, and I'll come back to it. And one of the things that I've gotten stuck with is in the Jewish thinking, and I'm not sure how pervasive it is in the Jewish thinking, but my understanding is that a principle that is shot through, at least in the Jewish community, is that there isn't life until the baby is born or something is born and it breathes. The first breath. And, you know, the more I think about it, that's ensoulment. Now, I think that's disputed to some extent. I don't know how deep that is. So let's go back to Genesis. So while it's a poetic description of the thinking, so this goes back to 2,500 years or so, that the whole composition of Genesis was developed, as they had to come to a sense of where did all this come from, and who's the creator, and how does it work? And it stretched out over time. It stretched out over time, and God has these 4 days, and I like to think of, you know, so it goes to 7 days. 6 days, God is up to doing one thing after another. Well, it was over millions of years. It didn't like, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, got it all done. It was an evolution through time. But God was always in it. And then you come to, I think the 5th or 6th day, I'd have to look it up. You know, God said, you know, there's something missing in this beautiful creation, and that's somebody that looks like me. You know, so it needed an image that was like God to be part of this creation. And so there was a formation, a creation of man and woman in the image of God. So in that sense, every person. There was no birth involved until chapter 2. So how did this man and woman evolve out of this whole thing? Well, at first, in chapter 2, and these are 2 different authors that put this thing together. So in chapter 2, God goes to work just to form an atom, you know, a man or a human. Let's just say a human. And what does God do? He takes clay of the earth, takes water, forms this thing like an artist who's shaping something, you know, maybe think of a sculptor chipping this thing away and keeps working with it and keep working with it. And it's just a piece of clay that's been shaped, designed according to the artist's mindset and shaped. And then you have this chunk of clay that looks pretty good, you know? And then there is the idea that, and then it comes to life. God breathes on it and it comes to life. But the atom is really talking about the dirt of the earth. It's not a reference to a male or a female. It's this thing that God created. And rather soon, same chapter, God said, gee, that poor critter is lonely. He's got all these animals around and all the rest, but he's lonely because he's the only one like me. So then what happens is out of that same form that God created comes out of the rib is the poetry, you know, the imagery that's used, comes Eve. And then you have Adam and Eve. No births yet until you get to chapter 4, where you have the first talk about a birth of Abel and Cain. You know, and he talks about producing. So, you know, I've been working on that. I'm not sure how solid it is. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'm trying to ground the whole thing and trying to think. My own sense is that I think the Jewish community that says until the breath of God breathes into this thing that is born, you don't have a human being. And I've also read that even beyond the birth, that there is a period of time, and I think, Bob, you said something about it, that there are a lot of births that quickly die, even after they've been born, and they cry, and there's oxygen, you know, and they're getting oxygen to some extent through the blood of the mother, but that's not a breath. And unless their lungs are working, they're not going to live. So I think there's something to that Jewish wisdom that says it's still evolving before you're going to call it a person, that thou shalt not kill. You know, but it can die. So my thinking increasingly as I struggle with this doggone thing, you know, I resist the whole thing that with fertilization, you've got a person. And I don't think our Catholic teaching ever goes back to that point that, you know, well, there's a fertilization, well, that's a person, and it's going to have to grow into it, but they treat it as though it's a person. I don't think that's anywhere in formal teaching. Bod Charpentier, maybe you know. And then you have this thing at the Jewish, I'm inclining to the Jewish end of this.
That's two of us.
Well, you know, there's a kind of a crass joke, but I got to say it. Question, when does a fetus become a human being in the Jewish faith? Answer, upon graduation from law school.
Just,
you know, the point that actually brings out is we tend to be talking in binary either or terms, and we should be trying to discover a process in this, where, you know, something doesn't suddenly become, you know, an instant where something becomes something, but that there is a process that needs to be respected. But well, it's not an absolute black and white either or thing.
Well, I happen to agree with you. I think. I haven't mentioned this. I for a long time as a lawyer did work for the Right to Life League back in the 70s, cases I wouldn't take today, and got some notable successes, and you know, formed a somewhat heretical thought that the Right to Life League people were fine, but I'd rather have a drink with the ACLU people that I was opposing. But that's a different issue. But Bob, I want to build on Tim's question just for a minute. It seems to me that for centuries we were talking about ensoulment. You know, Aquinas says it's X time, and Augustine said whatever he said, and Tertullian said whatever he said, and in spite of that, I read recently somewhere that the church, in spite of this, timing question about ensoulment, the church always said, yeah, that's all nice, but abortion's wrong. Abortion's a sin, whenever you do it, ensouled or not.
And
Is
why?
that true?
And why is that? It's a little bit like I can remember from one of the classes, Professor Heylen coming in and saying, this problem is a little bit like, it's a little bit like the issue related to alcoholism. What you don't do at an international or national meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous is walk in and start singing the praises of alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And he just dropped it and left it there, as in, George, sort of related to what you're saying. Let me just throw out another bomb.
Well, I'm asking because I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah,
that it was always condemned at every stage.
I spoke a little bit earlier, referred to the position of the church is one of playing it safe with regard to these issues where there is some doubt. Essentially, it's been attributed to the Jesuits, but it's more than that. The position of tutiorism, the Latin safety, tutior, err on the safe side. If you're in doubt, be sure to play it safe. And I think it's fair to say, really, always, and should it be that way?
It depends, because you could say, let's see, is a fetus a living person? Well, kin sabe, who knows, etc. So where are we going to give the benefit of the doubt? Are we going to give the benefit of the doubt to the pregnant woman and her autonomy and choice and health and these considerations? Okay, makes sense. Or are we going to give the benefit of the doubt to the fetus and say, well, maybe you are a living person, so we better not kill you? Where should the benefit of the doubt go?
Yeah, good.
You can make a rational case either way, it seems to me.
Well, what if there's no, you're right, George, what if there's no one answer?
Well,
and what's the relevance of our conversation here to a 10-year-old girl who's been raped and hasn't had sexual relationships because she wants to be a parent or because she loves a person, which, in the Catholic view, procreation is the main purpose of sexual relationships, and that's totally out of it. So wouldn't the church give a pass on that, saying there was no intent at all of having a child born? Did the rapist want to be a father? Is that why he did that? No. Okay, so wouldn't the meaningfulness, which is a very important part of it, have a factor in whether that 10-year-old should be able to get an abortion without being condemned by the church or seen as doing something terrible?
I would think, George, but that 10-year-old is so the exception.
No, it's just a question I'm posing. I don't know. I'm just posing that because it's a question.
Yeah, I have to say I get disturbed by these questions being asked in an either-or sense. I think it's important, for example, with the 10-year-old, Pope Francis is pointing the way there. What that 10-year-old needs is not to have that baby, nor to get an abortion, but what that 10-year-old needs is somebody to accompany her in making that decision in a human way.
And that's probably her parents.
Maybe not. Well, maybe not.
Maybe not.
But she needs, in other words, In other words, what she really needs, and the obligation on the part of those who claim to be Christian, is to provide some kind of a way that she can be accompanied in discerning her way through this this dilemma, this terrible decision.
How could a
I think that's
10-year-old
a
do
little
that?
bit unrealistic. You can't have a 10-year-old figure out what it is to care 24/7 for a new creature. That's totally, to me,
Well, and you know,
there's no way she could make a decision about that.
and if she by herself, she doesn't. But if she's within a kind of and again, she undoubtedly isn't, but within a kind of an atmosphere of a family that says, honey, whichever way we go, you go. Let's try to decide this together, not impose a solution one way or the other on you. Now, I realize that's may not be realistic. It certainly isn't in our own day, but isn't that something that perhaps Francis and the church are calling us to consider? What would be a practical way
Sure.
of the Christian community actually embracing this person within this dilemma, rather than simply saying, well, you gotta bear the child, or you gotta abort, one or the other.
One of the cases I worked on a long time ago in front of the California Supreme Court had to deal with the question of parental notification. Minor becomes pregnant, minor wants to, or thinks she wants to have an abortion. Can that go forward without involving her parents? And that's the position that won out. And the ACLU, the pictures they would conjure up, that religious parents, pro-life parents, or these knuckle-dragging simian-type bullies, and forcing the kid not to have an abortion. And I always was willing to bet that among middle class and successful people, there'd be far more often pressure on the kid to have the abortion, in Beverly Hills, or but nobody ever thought about that or talked about it. And it's a mess.
It's a mess.
It's just a mess. But Bob, oh shoot, I forgot what I was going to ask you. Back in the ensoulment days, didn't the church never? Oh, I know what I was going to say. You asked what it serves to have an absolute bar, a prohibition of abortion. And I, who do not favor an absolute bar, could think of something it would further. And that's the notion of divine providence. That here is this child developing in a uterus, and the child is going to have to, leap some hurdles and get past this peril and that peril to avoid a spontaneous abortion. But if he or she keeps navigating this path, wouldn't we think as Catholics that there is God's plans are involved for that being? And who are we to just step in and say, boom, and just end all that, end this Providence's role in the becoming a person of this clump of cells. Where's Chavira? I need Chavira on that one. But anyway.
I wanted to mention that someone sent the Cardinal Sean's letter about gods.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I sent it.
And like all the other discussions about abortion, there never is any mention of the father. And the father having some responsibility, whether it was intended or not, in the whole issue and the whole discussion. It seemed to me if you're going to take the synodal approach suggested by Tom, that person should be part of the conversation. And that's always lacking. And really that's, I wonder, since George is always talking about what about all the women say so, I wonder how much it's because of what women think that the fathers are left out. I don't know. I'm just.
The Supreme Court, Fred, in Webster versus State of Missouri, and I don't know when it was decided, I think in the 70s, said that fathers have no rights. You know,
Really?
Yeah, even married fathers.
Well, that's because of American individualism. But that's not a Catholic view.
It's not a Catholic view. Yeah, of course not.
Yeah.
But it's the, I wonder if that's still good law after this Dobbs case. I don't see how it could be. Wait.
Well,
Fred,
you have
doubt that's good law anymore, Webster.
Fred, you have an excellent point there. And as a mediator, my job was to work in a setting where fathers were exerting their rights. They said, I want a right to be a father. And the women's movement was even supporting that, saying dad should be more involved, et cetera, et cetera. But when the buck stops, the mother's the one who's carrying the child, right, and gives birth. She's pregnant for 9 months, and the dad can go traipsing off. And so it depends on the dad's sense of responsibility. So there have been movements in various communities to see if dads can step up to the plate, both with their time and with their money post-divorce. So there are these child support laws, et cetera, and visitation. You can't order a father to visit the children and so forth. But that's excellent. But I think the person who's, in a case of a rape or something, it's a whole different ballgame. It's really different, because will that father say, okay, if you bring that child to birth, I will take the child and raise it? How many people are going to say that? I don't know. But but the buck will stop with the mother, because that's their nature. They've carried the child for 9 months, and they're, that's kind of the nature of what biologically at that point anyway.
I actually wrote.
Okay, I'm troubled by something that's happened. What I think is happening is, are we as a group of guys, are we searching for some opening? And George Crook, I'm thinking of you. Are we looking for some theological, biological opening that abortion, or theological, biological, or societal, like rape? Are we looking for some, not excuses, are we looking for some reasons to allow abortion? I mean, you're talking about the case of the 10-year-old. Well, okay, so are we searching for a way to justify that, regardless of ensoulment issues? I mean, I guess that I'm trying to get myself around what are we looking for? Are we looking for some sort of evidence that we all can accept about the concept of ensoulment, which I'd never heard before today? Are we looking for an explanation that says abortion under any circumstance is wrong? It's not God's will. Are we looking for some openings, some exceptions? I'm confused as to what we're trying to do. And that's just me. I mean, I'm the most uneducated in these matters of any of you guys on this conference call, but I'm confused. I'm confused. Are we looking for, what are we looking for here?
If 50 to 60% of abortions are spontaneous in the first weeks, first month of life, is that God's will? And I don't throw that out to be adversarial, but just to continue the conversation with you, Timothy. If it happens spontaneously, no big deal. I mean, I don't mean that. I don't mean to sound facetious. I mean, if it happens spontaneously, chromosomal aberration, so much so that these days, and there's some based on some of my fairly recent research, they're actually able, there have been some studies in the last 5 to 10 years of spontaneous abortions where there were histories, and they have actually able to identify the chromosomal aberrations and identify certain disease. All this, of course, in view of one day being able to intervene at very early time, so they'll be able to correct those. This is science fiction mostly, but be able to correct the chromosomal. But if more than half are spontaneous, is that God's will? Well, is that,
what do you think, Bob? What do you think? Do you think it is God's will, or do you think it's just is it an accident? Well, is every accident of nature God's will?
It's allowed. God allows it for reasons maybe that we don't understand, but it sure leads to incredible problems for all of us, and including given the number of spontaneous abortions, not to mention elected abortions later on. I'm looking at a quote here, which kind of struck me from the title of it says it all. The problem of spontaneous abortion, is the pro-life position morally monstrous? ? And this is from a text, the New Bioethics, Multidisciplinary Journal of Biotechnology and the Body in 2019. If you bear with me, just one more quote here. A substantial proportion of human embryos spontaneously abort after conception, and ethicists have argued this is problematic for the pro-life view that a human embryo has the same moral status as an adult from conception. Firstly, if human embryos are our moral equals, this entails spontaneous abortion is one of humanity's most important problems. And it's claimed this is absurd and a reductio of the moral status claim. Secondly, it's claimed that pro-life advocates do not act as if spontaneous abortion is important, implying they are failing to fulfill their moral obligations.
Or are being inconsistent.
If an early fetus, I mean, first 4 or 5 weeks,
yeah,
if it has a moral standing, does it have a legal standing? I mean, is that where we're coming to in the US, that an embryo will have a legal standing, Crook? Is that what you think's going on here?
Well,
Oh, it will in some states probably.
Yeah, I think there's a movement on that. I
Okay.
want to just offer a couple of thoughts if this is interrupting what Tim's on. I agree with Tom. I think this accompaniment.
Pick up the kids from tennis and then come and get us.
Or then they could help us carry up.
Yeah.
I was thinking that would be the way to do it.
I think Tom's note about accompaniment,
Oh,
it's
right
not
after you
either
get back
or when you have two different persons that are involved. So the idea of dialogue of the man and the woman and the family, that should be part of the consideration. But in that context, ultimately, and it's a little bit difficult to talk about the 10-year-old. So let's talk, about a young woman who's older, a bit older, maybe 15, 16. Conscience is another significant dimension of this whole thing. And in the end, and I'm going to share with you, I just had it, let me find it again, John Henry Newman, and this is what he has to say about conscience. Conscience is the voice of God. It is a messenger from him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and teaches and rules us by his representatives. I'm not sure what he's talking about as the representatives. And I think that in the accompaniment, in the end, it's not the parents or a physician or a psychologist necessarily. They have to accompany and help the individual think it through and arrive at what their conscience tells them. It seems to me that's principle. So if it's an 18-year-old young woman who has become pregnant and she weighs the whole thing out and she says, I really need to have an abortion, I think that's her conscience of the decision she has to make. And others can say, well, we're going to make it for you. And I think that is a part of what, at least my perception, that's happening in our country. The ultra-conservative Christians are trying to say, this is God's truth and everybody needs to conform to it. So anyway, that's a piece that's floating around in my head of trying to put this together.
Can I jump in for a little bit? Tim, you asked, what are we trying to do here? I'll tell you what I'm trying to do. I know that in November, I think representatives from the state legislature they want to make the right to abortion a constitutional fact in California. That's what I understand.
That's correct.
And if that happens, it has to go to the voters. So we have to make a decision. I mean, we're now in the same position as Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden to have to make a decision politically or about, it's not a question of saying
Yes.
it's moral or immoral. We can make it legal or illegal. For me, it's like saying, how definite can I be in my abortion? And knowing and wondering, there's the difference between something being immoral and something being illegal. We don't say, we believe that sex outside of marriage is immoral. That's what we say anyway. But we don't
say we believe that.
Well, I know, but I mean, that's what the church's sexual morality. But the church does not say, therefore it needs to be illegal. So it's a sure. So I'm just trying to say to myself, how will I vote at that particular time? Because if the Catholic Church's position, it is very clear that the people who have this, are you leaving? George is leaving? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, a family thing has come up. Okay.
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 I'll quit then.
No. Can I just add one concern I have? I actually find Bob's thing about the number of spontaneous abortions more compelling than I do the 10-year-old girl. I mean, 10-year-old girl is not the common happening in terms of people who choose to have abortions. But I also wonder about the larger issue about the value and place of children in our society and the impact this is having. not just on demographics, because that can get us into, politics and economy and all of that kind of thing, but on the notion of the place of children in our society, and the effect that has on communities over the longer period of time. And is the abortion controversy a piece of that? Not the whole thing, but a very important piece of it. And do we too often kind of get involved in the either or of the act rather than seeing it as an implied piece in a much larger kind of cultural set of values that are seem to prevail in our society?
Wow, Frank,
Sorry.
shit. I talk about throwing a curveball.
Yeah, sort of at the last minute, Frank, thanks.
Yeah, bottom of the ninth, he throws a curveball.
Well, I think
I've been sitting here and this has been going around in my mind. And I mean, a lot of this stuff is very helpful in piecing together as separate pieces of that puzzle. But in terms of a much more kind of global view of the issue, where does this all fit in? I mean, I find Bob's thing about Newman and conscience to be very compelling, because essentially that's what we use when we sit down with a couple and say, well, there's no way you're going to get an annulment, so let's figure out how you can go back to community, that kind of thing. But in terms of the much larger thing of, and then of course that does have economic, demographic, social, I mean, the replacement theory, etc., all of that kind of thing. Where does all this stuff fit in? And what's the impact of the abortion debate on it?
I'd like to say that I hear distant chimes ringing 12 times.
Yeah, I know.
That was mine.
No, it was actually mine too.
Oh, mine rang 3 times because it's 3 p.m. here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, this seems like a launching pad to a much broader and deeper discussion that should we attempt to take this up next week?
Yes.
I don't think we're finished.
We're not finished, that's for sure.
Can we invite Bob back on the condition that he understands that this is just a temporary reprieve on our one-time guest-only policy?
I see
Bob, would you like
a grin on his face? I think it's yes. I vote yes.
Yeah.
I do too. Do you have the time, Bob, next week?
I don't know. I'm going to have to look at calendar. I know I got some doggy mission scheduled because this doggy has some issues up at Guide Dogs in the vet clinic. But if you extend the invitation, I would, and if I can do it, or part of it anyway, I would be delighted to continue to be part of the conversation, because I am finding it fascinating and interesting. And I can see why some others who have joined you one time might have come back on occasion.
We can't get rid of them.
I guess that's you're probably doing something intriguing that causes folk to hang around a little bit. So let's see what happens.
It must just be that we like each other, because there are the missing guy, Ned Chavira, is his views are not being represented here today. They're somewhat different from mine, for example,
I saw his note. Yeah, he had to tend to family.
And George, you and he will probably be discussing this personally by phone, probably several times a day for the next week.
Yeah, because we don't agree.
Yeah. One thing, there's a couple of things I'd like to suggest, at least one. The one thing is, I will get this video out to everybody the link to the video as soon as I get it up on YouTube. Bob, just to refresh everybody, I put it up more or less privately. It's what they call unlisted. So you have to have the particular link in order to watch it, which means it's not available to anybody except those that I share the link with. It's up to your conscience to decide who you share the link with. But so this is about as private as we can make it. So that'll be good for Ned. But I'd like to suggest that we might engage in some mutual reply all type of email conversation during this week, perhaps more asking some questions, or maybe try not to get into a lengthy dissertation, but perhaps carry this conversation forward in print a bit for those who may want to, and that might launch us into next week.
Reducing your thoughts to writing clarifies the mind better than anything.
It does clarify, but
So,
makes
Tom,
it less exciting too.
Bob, would you make sure Tom has your contact information?
You all have his contact information.
We do.
Oh,
we do. Okay.
Do we have a CV?
Just I did a CC to Bob for the last when I sent the link.
Do we have a CV?
His CV.
Yeah, that's Latin, Tim.
Yes, I know. That's up to Bob if he wants to. If he is allowed to send that large a file,
Right.
by email.
Do you want all of his refereed articles, George, or you just want to know,
Well, the highlights, the
highlights,
version, if it exists.
Why don't we just say what we want to say if we want to in print between now and then, and ask whatever questions we want to and get clarifications and all of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure. Rather than to be more formal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hi,
Bob, I very much appreciate if you could send me that last document you were reading from. That was very powerful.
I was thinking I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah.
And exactly what that reference is. And it is available online at Google Scholar.
Are you talking about Cardinal Newman on conscience, or the gentleman on the number of spontaneous abortion?
That one.
Yeah, that I would love to see.
Yeah, I'd like to see that too.
There may be a little bit of confusion because there are two Bobs here, so we might have to refer to one as by the last name and the other one as Bob or Charpentier.
Yeah, but they're both French.
BB and BC.
BC, yeah.
BB and BC. That's another way of going. Tom, thank you very much for having invited me. Thank you, George. I know he's not there right now. He said this is an interesting group. He wasn't kidding. I very much appreciated being able to just share with you and keep it conversationally, and look forward to being here next time with you for all or part of the conversation. And on that note,
no, we're going to close. I have a closing prayer. So who I'm thinking of during this whole conversation is Blessed Mary, and wondering, okay, here's someone who, 14, 15 years old, was pregnant, and did she really believe this spirit that came, and all that kind of stuff. And so let's close with a Hail Mary, just asking her for some insight as we struggle through this. So Hail Mary, full of grace.
Full of grace.
The Lord is with you.
Blessed
Blessed
art
art thou, Lord,
Blessed
and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Jesus.
Holy,
Holy
Holy
Mary,
Mary,
Mother
Mother
of
of God,
Pray for
Pray
pray
us
for
for us sinners,
now.
now
now,
and at the hour.
yeah, our death.
Amen.
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 Love you
Amen.
guys.
love you all. God
Thanks.
bless
See you
you.
all.
Thank you, thank you.